coming up on Rhetorically Defective.
You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
The explosive true story of May 19th, America's first female terrorist group.
And once they asked for a manager and no one came, the white
women went on a bombing campaign.
And the domestic terrorism enhancement that was applied to it.
Shut up, you demon clown shirt slag.
I have a hard time being a man.
Now, I grew up in Austria. I'm very aware of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It was a night of rampage against the Jews carried out in 1938 at the Nazi equivalent of the Proud Boys.
They're now in hiding, living in this 300-square-foot recreational vehicle somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. We agreed not to disclose exactly where.
Now I'm just purely confused. Why, if he's trying to hide from people and the harassment is so bad, why on earth would you ever say he's in the Rocky Mountains? Violent revolutionary communism has been around since at least the 70s. They bombed several government buildings, including the US Capitol building, and robbed banks to fund their activism. I'm going to show you how the media treats them with kid gloves, compared to the brazenly unfair and unfounded domestic terrorist allegations regarding the Proud Boys and January 6th. We now have a justice system that is openly and provably targeting political opposition that speaks out against the progressive left. The goal of communism is no borders, global communism, which also meets the goals of powerful elites that convene at the World Economic Forum. There are people intentionally perpetuating this encroachment on individual civil liberties, and useful idiots along the way. Let's start with a useful idiot quoting the 1976 movie, Network.
But I'm mad too. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Name the movie.
That movie. It's a great movie.
Name the title.
Network.
Oh, there you go. Love it. Love it.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore! I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
I can't believe I finally agree with Stuttering John. What a good movie. Seems oddly relevant to today's societal problems. Let's see if we can find any further parallels. This next scene involves the media pitching a story about black revolutionary communists recording themselves committing crimes. There's so many underground communist uprisings that they get them confused. They'll show a well-to-do white woman becoming radicalized into assisting them in their crimes to bring down the system.
The Communist Party believes that the most pressing political necessity today is the consolidation of the revolutionary, radical, and democratic movements into a united front.
What we're going to see now is something really sensational. The Flagstaff Independent Bank of Arizona was ripped off last week by a terrorist group called the Ecumenical Liberation Army, and they themselves actually took movies of the rip-off while they were ripping it off. Wait till you see it.
The Ecumenical Liberation Army, that's not the one that kidnapped Patty Hearst.
No, that's the Symbionese Liberation Army. This is the Ecumenical Liberation Army. They're the ones who kidnapped Mary Ann Gifford 3 weeks ago. There's a hell of a lot of liberation armies in the revolutionary underground and a lot of kidnapped heiresses. This is Mary Ann Gifford.
You mean they actually shot this film while they were ripping off the bank?
Well, yeah, wait till you see it. I don't know whether to edit or leave it raw like this.
This is terrific stuff.
That movie was made in 1976. 7 years later, in 1983, a female-led communist group bombed the U.S. Capitol building.
My name is William Rosenau. I'm the author of Tonight We Bombed the U.S. Capitol, the explosive true story of May 19th, America's first female terrorist group.
Well, slap my thighs until they're as pink as a Georgia peach. He forgot to include that they're a communist organization that's Marxist-Leninist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist. Sounds about Black Lives Matter to me. And to the people that are gonna be like, oh, so you're not anti-racist? Yeah, I'm not anti-racist. I'm just not racist. Swing and a miss! And against their father's best wishes,
they teamed up with a bunch of black militants. They were involved in a whole series of bank robberies to raise money for black liberation inside the United States.
And once they asked for a manager and no one came, the white
women went on a bombing campaign. They decided to target what they considered to be imperialism directly. So they bombed an FBI field office in New York. They bombed Fort McNair in Washington, specifically the National War College. They bombed the Washington Navy Yard twice. They bombed the police union headquarters in New York. And as probably their most infamous bombing act, on November 7th, 1983, they bombed the U.S. Capitol. Some of the members got caught along the way. In November 1984, one of the women, Susan Rosenberg, and one of the men, Timothy Blanc, were arrested outside a storage locker. They found hundreds of pounds of TNT, high explosives, thousands of rounds of ammunition, automatic weapons, fully automatic Uzi rifles, shotguns and pistols with the serial numbers filed off. They didn't kill anyone during their bombings, but they could have, and they certainly considered it. They talked about assassinating Henry Kissinger, who'd been Secretary of State under Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. They talked about assassinating policemen, judges, prosecutors, enemies of the people. These individuals weren't peaceful protesters. In some of the interviews I've done, people have tried to compare them, today's Antifa to them. It's like, no. These people were serious professional revolutionaries.
Right. Antifa aren't serious professional revolutionaries. They're just guided by serious professional revolutionaries. And instead of using bombs on buildings, they just throw Molotov cocktails and light police stations on fire. Completely different. Not even close to the same. I mean, I guess it's an improvement, but let's go back to this Nubian seduced slam pig.
In November 1984, one of the women, Susan Rosenberg,
16 years into her 58-year sentence, manages to score a puff-piece interview with 60 Minutes, rationalizing her charges.
The government refused and dropped the Brinks charges, saying it was satisfied with that tough 58-year weapon sentence.
This case ruined my life. I was labeled and defined by this case.
In 1998, she applied for parole and had a stack of support. The prison psychologist who said she was the most outstanding inmate he'd ever dealt with.
Well, ring my balls like a church bell and take a fat, smelly dump of my steak dinner. Wouldn't you know that just over a month later, on his last day of his presidency, Bill Clinton commuted her sentence and set her free from prison.
Officially, the primary Black Lives Matter group is simply a project of another nonprofit called 1,000 Currents. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because the current vice chair of 1,000 Currents is a woman called Susan Rosenberg. And she's a convicted terrorist who spent 16 years in federal prison before she was given a pardon by Bill Clinton on the very last day in office. Bernie Kerik remembers this well. He's the former police commissioner of New York City, but before that, he worked in New Jersey, and he personally escorted Susan Rosenberg from the federal courthouse in Newark in 1985.
It's a revolutionary Marxist group. That's what it is. It's a group that wants to overthrow this government, the country. It's a group that its three founders were inspired by a woman named Joanne Chesimard, who goes by an African named Assata Shakur, who lives in exile in Cuba after she assassinated a New Jersey state trooper. She was involved in a number of bombings and executions of New York City cops, cops in San Francisco, and cops in New Jersey. Now, in the last few weeks, we learn Susan Rosenberg is one of their fundraising gurus, let's say. Well, Susan Rosenberg, in 1985, when you look at that photo, she was convicted of possessing hundreds of pounds of explosives. She was involved, her and her organization, the May 19th Communist Organization, they were involved in a number of police assassinations, bombings, the U.S. Capitol bombing. She was a radical revolutionary, and she was let out of prison. She was commuted on the last day of President Clinton's term in office. After 16 years in prison, she was given 58 years in prison, and now she's out. Who does she work for? Black Lives Matter.
Well, hold on. Let's fact check what this far-right news organization is saying. Let's go to Snopes and see what they have to say. Fact check. Did a convicted terrorist sit on the board of a BLM funding body? Oh, that's a mixture of the truth. What's true? Susan Rosenberg has served as vice chair on the board of directors for Thousand Currents, an organization that provides fundraising and fiscal sponsorship for Black Lives Matter global movement. She was an active member of revolutionary left-wing movements whose illegal activities included bombing U.S. government buildings and committing armed robberies. What's undetermined? In the absence of a single, universally agreed definition of terrorism, it's a matter of subjective determination as to whether the actions for which Rosenberg was convicted and imprisoned, possession of weapons and hundreds of pounds of explosives, should be described as acts of domestic terrorism. So can we really call it domestic terrorism? Well, I'll tell you what we can apparently call domestic terrorism.
The former leader of the extremist Proud Boys group, Enrique Tarrio, was sentenced to 22 years in prison today for his role in the January 6th attack.
Tarrio wasn't at the Capitol on January 6th because he was arrested a few days prior for setting fire to a Black Lives Matter banner, but he did direct his Proud Boys to attack the Capitol without him. What's the significance of this 22-year sentence and the domestic terrorism enhancement that was applied to it?
Shut up, you demon clown shirt slag. Let me unpack what they just said.
Tarrio wasn't at the Capitol on January 6th because he was arrested a few days prior for setting fire to a Black Lives Matter banner.
He's getting 22 years in prison for domestic terrorism, and he wasn't even at January 6th because he was already arrested for lighting a Black Lives Matter banner on fire. This is so politically biased that he wasn't even there, and the reason why he wasn't even there is because they politically arrested him.
But he did direct his Proud Boys to attack the Capitol without him.
He directed his Proud Boys, which really just means he said to his friends, "That would be so sick if you went to the Capitol, because I can't go there because I was just arrested for setting a Black Lives Matter banner on fire." So far, I can't really justify the 22-year sentence.
What's the significance of this 22-year sentence and the domestic terrorism enhancement that was applied to it?
So the domestic terrorism enhancement is important because it recognizes the intent of the January 6th event. Now, when we're thinking about January 6th, we should always be thinking about a broad group of people, not all of whom had plans to become violent and storm the Capitol that day.
So January 6th, we should think of it as like a broad group of people, you know, like an idea. Like it's not a very specific thing. It's a broad group of people. Like an idea.
Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you gotta be
not
kidding.
militia.
Antifa is just an idea that never coordinated with Black Lives Matter, the movement, which had a Black Lives Matter organization that raised $90 million in a year, that served as a money laundering scheme, funneling money into leftist resources.
But in the case of Tarrio and the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and affiliated groups who have now been found guilty and sentenced for seditious conspiracy, they were planning to do this.
They were planning to do this. What is this? Have the Capitol officers let them in voluntarily?
They were violent, and they're part of a long, decades-long movement of white power activists and militant right activists who have waged war on the United States since the early 1980s.
Actually, lady in my video, if you watched my video, you would know that since the 70s and early 80s, there's been a feverish, violent uprising from communists, white women working with black men because they hate their dads, that are communist revolutionaries, bombing federal buildings, getting arrested, and then being pardoned by Bill Clinton. It's almost like what they're accusing the right of is actually true about them. It's almost like it's the iron law of woke projection. Like that's specifically, she said, the early 80s, which is when
Susan Rosenberg
was found with hundreds of pounds of explosives.
So this is still not the maximum sentence. 22 years, the headlines are reading long sentence, but the prosecutors were asking for 33. And in each case, the judge has handed down below the recommended sentencing guidelines for these defendants.
That just makes it sound like the prosecutors overcharged them and the judge, I can't even call it reasonable, made a more reasonable assessment of their charges. What are their charges? They were violent and told to attack the Capitol, and they're domestic terrorists. Why do I have to do research to find out why a domestic terrorist got 22 years? Alright guys, not women, not trans people. Alright guys, let's try and find out what Homeboy did to get a domestic terrorism charge for 22 years in federal prison.
39-year-old Enrique Tarrio, once the top leader of the far-right extremist group, the Proud Boys, was just sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for orchestrating the failed plot to forcibly block the peaceful transfer of power following the 2020 presidential election. It is the longest sentence yet, stemming from the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol.
I'm sorry, I don't give a wet flappy dog fart if somebody attacks or assaults the Capitol. Communists have bombed in the early 80s when Larry Bird was winning championships, government buildings, including the Capitol, and been pardoned by a sitting president to then join organizations that fund Black Lives Matter. This guy wasn't at January 6th and directed his people to attack the Capitol. I kind of want to show you my research of trying to find what he did to justify a 22-year sentence, and I can't find it.
The man federal prosecutors called the leader of the conspiracy that led to the January 6th attacks, former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio, stood in court today and asked the judge to show mercy, adding how sorry he was for the events that occurred that day. But Judge Timothy Kelly, who sentenced Tarrio to the longest jail sentence yet for any January 6 defendant, pointed to this text message Tarrio sent after the Capitol had been breached.
All right, awesome. We have a text message. We're going to justify the 22-year sentence right now with this text message. This is what really swayed the judge. It must be rather egregious. It would make the most sense if they showed the most damning evidence right now to justify such a long sentence, to show everybody what you can't say, or else you're going to get a 22-year sentence.
Pointed to this text message Tarrio sent after the Capitol had been breached. Proud of my boys and my country. Don't expletive leave.
The jury agreed with the government that he directed this, that he recruited the individuals who were in place and led the assault on the Capitol with the express intention of preventing the peaceful transfer of power.
I couldn't help but notice the lack of Proud Boys in their footage. One would think they would be showing Proud Boys doing this, and they would say, look, those are the Proud Boys that are doing this. But so far with the evidence that we have, they just said that he did that, and they can't even show it. Why wouldn't they show a video of the Proud Boys he directed to go to the Capitol? I think it's because they don't have it.
Tarrio's attorneys sought leniency, arguing he wasn't at the Capitol that day, watching from a hotel in Baltimore. A prior arrest had banned him from traveling to D.C. But prosecutors laid out how Tarrio mobilized a group of 200 to march on the Capitol, posting that they would turn out in record numbers that day, and responding to President Trump's 2020 debate comment.
Stand back and stand by.
Tarrio writing, standing by, sir. His Proud Boys co-defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 18 years, one of whom, Dominic Pizzola, shouted Trump won in the courtroom moments after his sentencing ended.
I don't think that was enough for 22 years, and for the other guys to get like 15 years, 18 years. They could say this about anybody. This is the uncomfortable part of the conversation. They could really make this accusation against the Antifa members that were lighting police stations on fire during the St. Floyd riots. I'm really not seeing a lot of violence here, unless you include the mysterious suicides of 4 Capitol police officers.
Also tonight, there is tragic news. 2 more law enforcement officers who responded to the January 6th riot have taken their own lives. Washington, D.C. police officer Gunther Hashida was found dead at his home Thursday. He was an 18-year veteran of the force. And just a short time ago, confirmation that one of the Metro Police colleagues of his, Officer Kyle DeFreytag, died by suicide last month. They are now the 3rd and 4th officers who defended the Capitol to do so. Meantime, the Washington Post reports Trump ally, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, is pushing the theory the FBI knew more about the planning.
It might be like the most suicides days after an insurrection in recorded history. Is there any insurrection with more than 4? I'm pretty sure the suicides outweigh the homicides in this insurrection. They couldn't even show the intention of him, they couldn't even show him saying, make sure you interrupt the peaceful transfer of power. Everything they're saying is a narrative, it's propaganda. If you disagree, you can send me a link in the comments, we can talk on Twitter, but I can't find it. I'm still looking for the domestic terrorism justification, and especially when I compare it to actual extreme terrorism that was pardoned, it's really difficult to be on board with this sentence, don't you think? I get there's people that don't agree with him politically and they want him to seem like a threat, but you don't think that the fascism of the state is ever going to turn on you when, this is the precedent that we're setting, where they can just say you did it? Well, why don't you just show us? Especially when they gave another puff piece to Ray Epps.
As soon as President Trump is finished speaking, we are going to the Capitol. It's that direction.
What exactly was the role of Ray Epps in the chaos of January 6th?
The theory, Epps, a former member of the Oath Keepers, was an FBI informant who incited the crowd on January 6th. The conspiracy theory starts here, the night of January 5th. The Marine veteran tried to take charge.
I'm going to put it out there. I'm probably going to go to jail for it, okay? Tomorrow, we need to go into the Capitol. Into the Capitol. What? No! Peacefully. Fed.
To summon the crowd, Epps seemed so over the top, he must have been a government agent, a Fed sent to entrap them.
When you said, we have to go into the Capitol, we have to go into the Capitol, what were you thinking?
I said some stupid things.
It's a conspiracy theory that Ray Epps had some sort of deeper involvement into January 6th because people saw how other people were being arrested and the guy on camera screaming, we need to go into the Capitol, and then everyone's in a circle calling him a Fed. We should just ignore that guy. He doesn't deserve any attention whatsoever. It's a 2-tier justice system.
Epps may have led the breach team that first entered the Capitol on January 6th.
The convoluted conspiracy theory made its way to Capitol Hill.
It's not the Proud Boys who engage in the initial breach. It's Ray Epps at that precise moment.
How did Ray Epps know that there were going to be pipe bombs?
Ms. Sadburn, who is Ray Epps?
That question has animated Fox News host Tucker Carlson for nearly 2 years.
Ray Epps? He's on video several times encouraging crimes, riots, breaches of the Capitol.
Carlson has focused on Epps more than 20 times on his top-rated show, a half-dozen times so far this year.
He's obsessed with me.
This is how you know it's propaganda. They never show that Tucker Carlson is wrong or incorrect. They show the behavior that Ray Epps did, and they're justifying it. And then when they show the opposition, they just say that the opposition is talking about it a whole lot. But the reason why the opposition is talking about it a whole lot is because nobody else is talking about it. It's gaslighting 101. There just seems to be way more evidence for domestic terrorism against Ray Epps than there is against Enrique Tarrio and the Proud Boys. If anybody has anything to show me for the contrary, all you're gonna show me is, well, they said they did this. Okay, well, we're seeing Ray Epps do this, and we're seeing the media completely minimalize his impact on what happened.
The next morning, January 6th, Epps was out by the Washington Monument, still focused on a single goal.
We are going to the Capitol, where our problems are. It's that direction.
Here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
While President Trump was still speaking at the Ellipse, Ray Epps walked toward the Capitol. He told us he wanted to be up front to help keep the peace. What happened next at Peace Circle, where protesters first overran police, is seen as a smoking gun. Epps pulled this agitated rioter aside and said something. Conspiracists say he was giving marching orders, because seconds later, this happened. The first Capitol police officer goes down.
How about the one guy? Go in, get in there, everybody. Epps, get in there, go, go, go. Nothing happens to him.
The Epps would dispute that. After former President Trump mentioned Epps by name, harassment and death threats picked up.
When Trump said nothing happened to Epps, he meant legally. He didn't mean that there was no other blowback, as if people on the right don't get insane death threats from leftists all the time. He meant nothing happened to him legally. Stop, guys. Come on.
It got so bad they were forced to sell their 5-acre ranch outside Phoenix. They're now in hiding, living in this 300-square-foot recreational vehicle somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. We agreed not to disclose exactly where.
Now I'm just purely confused. Why, if he's trying to hide from people and the harassment is so bad, why on earth would you ever say he's in the Rocky Mountains? None of this makes sense. And then you start talking about how it makes no sense and they call you a conspiracy theorist. Why are you telling people he's in the Rocky Mountains? And then you give yourself a big old grand pat in the back that, hey, we said he's in the Rocky Mountains, but we agreed we're not going to let you know where in the mountains he is. What are we watching?
I have a hard time being a man.
I grew up in Austria. I'm very aware of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It was a night of rampage against the Jews carried out in 1938 by the Nazi equivalent of the Proud Boys.
Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio, ex-Proud Boys leader, sentenced to 22 years for January 6th riot role. And that role was, he was texting people, cheering them on. We're already seeing a whole bunch of videos of people having their homes raided by feds. Now, in 2023, 2.5 years later, there's how many people were there at the Capitol? We know that people who wandered in clueless, a few hours after the start of everything, were criminally charged and sentenced to a year or more. We know that the people who were storming the front and actually engaged in violence have been criminally charged, but there are hundreds more, maybe even 1,000 more, who have not yet been charged, who were there, and we're starting to see these videos pop up.
InfoWars host Owen Shroyer was sentenced on Tuesday to 2 months behind bars for joining the mob's riot at the U.S. Capitol, which prosecutors said he helped create by spewing violent rhetoric and spreading baseless claims of election fraud to hundreds of thousands of viewers.
But let's just go back to the judge's comments at sentencing where he says, I'm not merely just a trespasser. Well, okay, so what are we insinuating here? I'm not merely just a trespasser. Well, that's interesting because I'm only charged with one misdemeanor, which is entering and remaining on government restricted grounds. If I'm not merely just a trespasser, then where are the other charges? They want to charge me as if I'm not just merely a trespasser, but they didn't because there's no evidence. They have no evidence. There is no evidence.
If you really want to experience how little evidence they have, try and talk to any of these sycophant leftists about these charges. They essentially say the charges are the evidence. Well, they charged them. All of a sudden, all of their advocacy for black people and being improperly charged goes out the window, and now just the fact that they're being charged means that they're guilty. They won't show you any evidence. Try and talk to them. Try and ask these people to justify these long sentences, or even these short sentences, of what they did that was different than other people there.
So now, essentially what the government is arguing is that, well, we can charge you or plea you down to a misdemeanor, but then we're really still charging you and punishing you for much, much larger crimes that have nothing to do with this case or charge at all. Think about the dangerous precedent of that. They have no evidence that I did anything illegal other than, I guess, entering and remaining on restricted grounds on January 6th, which, let's be perfectly clear here, and I don't want to throw anybody else under the bus, but the government submitted evidence that I entered and remained on restricted grounds. In the evidence they submitted, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other people, and I'm the only one that's been charged. So what else am I left to assume except that this is political? Well, what are they quoting me with from January 6th? You won't believe this. Read the sentencing memo. Because I chanted 1776, they're saying that's offensive and criminal, worthy of incarceration. Because I chanted USA, they're saying that's offensive and worthy of criminal incarceration. What's interesting is they also quote that we wanted to de-escalate the situation. That's a quote from their sentencing memo. And that I said we're here to peacefully have our voices heard. Peacefully have our voices heard. What does that sound like to you? Incitement, amping up a crowd? No, of course, that's the exact opposite. So you're saying, well, okay, a 30-page memo, Shroyer, certainly they have more in there. Oh, they do. They do. And it turns out the biggest fan of my show is the federal government. They're quoting things I said on my talk show from before and after January 6th. Not in D.C., nothing to do with the event, not even having anything to do with the events of that day. Me criticizing Biden, me questioning an election. Those are quotes in the sentencing memo that they've determined is worthy of incarceration. So this is a very unique case.
Yeah, that's a unique case, like a person with Down syndrome is unique. All of these cases look really similar, and they're retarded. So yeah, I don't really know what else to say. It's a two-tier justice system. Be careful when you're out there disagreeing and doing a less violent version of what the left does. Later, y'all.